and we're on track to have another great day for the top 8 here.
Yeah, I was going to say we're starting with an absolute barnstormer here. Two of the greatest players on earth. But then again, given the composition of the top 8, it was going to be hard not to be honest. Seth Manfield versus Gabriel Nassif, 2 Hall of Famers. Got another one in the booth with me as well. So this one is going to knock your socks off, my friends. And Reed, before we get stuck into this match, you noticed something pretty interesting on Twitter today. Something that Seth had shared with the world.
Yeah, Seth said on Twitter yesterday when he qualified, or when he saw the bracket, he said, "I've made 3 final days this calendar year. I consider that a major success, maybe my best year of MTG ever results-wise. Once tomorrow is over, I will have played against Gabriel Nassif in all 3 of those final days." That is an amazing statistic. I think these two guys, even before this year, you couldn't have written the history of Magic the Gathering without them. But I think this rivalry building is going to be one of the major stories of 2020, particularly if we can get a good match out of this right here.
Absolutely, and I'd say it is going to shape up to be a great match here. We've got a classic story of good versus evil, while both of these players are, of course, very well respected and well loved by much of the community. Well, you can't say the same about the decks they're playing here. Seth Manfield, our hero on the hill here with Dimir Rogues, a rogue deck in both style and substance, taking on public enemy number 1, Omnath, the John Dillinger of Standard at the moment, and Nassif off to a perfect start with it as well. Turn 2, Lucky Clover.
Yeah, so Riley, I think Cedric really did a great job of outlining the matchup here for us, where this should be a close one that Seth can definitely manage if Lucky Clover does not hit the battlefield. Now, this Dimir deck, it's looking to play a long game. Blue and black, historically colors that cannot easily remove a non-creature permanent from the battlefield. And Lucky Clover is just the quintessential, comes down early, gives Gabriel Nassif a huge advantage as the game goes long. I really like what Nassif did, just playing it on turn 2 with no fear here, because he's really limiting the number of reactions Seth can successfully take to get rid of the Lucky Clover. It's really just Lofty Denial, getting it on turn 2 before you have to worry about something like Drown in the Lock or Agonizing Remorse. And I think it's going to pay off in this particular game for Gabriel Nassif.
Yeah, pretty spectacularly too, as you see Giant Killer come down, draw a card with the Edgewall Innkeeper, tapping Gabriel Nassif out, meaning that this Thieves Guild Enforcer is not going to immediately die to a stomp. And here's Heartless Act as well. Unsurprising to see Manfield wanting to answer that 1-1. Agadeem's Awakening off the top. These Into the Story is a little awkward in this position. They're a while off getting that sweet discount here. But you have to think that Nassif, an early lead to him, sorry, Reed, an early lead to him thanks to that Lucky Clover.
The general idea with the Into the Story and with the Dimir deck in particular is you want to kind of spend the early turns dismantling what the opponent's doing, trading resources, whether that comes in the form of discard, removal, or counter spells. And then Into the Story is kind of your way to drop the hammer and refill after that early exchange of resources. But so far, Seth hasn't even been able to execute the first part of that game plan, which is neutralizing Nassif's threats and trading those resources, filling those graveyards.
Now, I mean, it's a little difficult to tell. There aren't that many cards in the graveyard here. It's certainly not enough for Drown in the Loch to be any use against Omnath as a counter spell. Maybe later it'll be able to get rid of it as a creature. But here, Reed is definitely, Manfield is definitely on the back foot. Reed, you're going great, mate. I just a quick little bit of feedback. You're definitely on the front foot here, mate. Doing really well so far. But not so for Seth Manfield, as this draw from Nassif has really punished him.
Yeah, I mean, this matchup is all about getting, or at least from Seth's perspective, it's all about getting your answers to line up cleanly against the opposing threats. And when you're kind of just barely missing the mark on exchange after exchange. We saw Seth draw into the counterspell off of his castle activation after Omnath hit the battlefield. You're missing the mark time after time. Things really start to spiral out of control, and your deck, kind of turns to ashes in your hands, and you can't accomplish anything.
Well, fans of Seth will be hoping that doesn't happen as we see a frantic inventory picking up 2 cards. Now, correct me if I'm wrong here, but we are playing a double elimination bracket, which means that even if Seth just kind of gets rumper-dumped here by Nassif and makes a quick exit from the upper quarters, it means that he's not out of the top 8 yet, right? Falls into the lower bracket and can battle his way back towards the championship match?
That's exactly right, Riley. This is a double elimination bracket, which means this is not a lose and out. The way I think of it is the goal for these players is to make it to the championship match, and you can either do that the easy way by getting a couple of wins and progressing through the upper bracket, or you can do it the hard way where you take a loss early, have to battle back. So it's conceivable that even the loser of this match could go very deep in the tournament. It's conceivable that these players could get a rematch later in the day. But for now, this is starting off as well as possible for Gabriel Nassif.
Yes, certainly looks like it. And I think worth pointing that out, the double elimination tournament structure. It is one that we've been using more recently with Premier Play with Magic. But for those who, the old guard, the people who've been around in the old Paper Pro Tours for a long time, would have been used to a single elimination Sunday, which is not the case here, and nor has it been for the last couple. So it's a little more forgiving for players who pick up an early loss. Now, Seth, having to have a careful think about what he wants to do here, he's into the story still just kind of dead weight in his hand after handily dealing with that Escape to the Wilds from Nassif here. But now Nassif, I mean, he's sitting pretty. He's got that Omnath. He's got 2 more copies of Escape to the Wilds. He's got Bone Crusher Giant and Lucky Clover. So there really isn't a whole lot that he's worried about from this position. He can just afford to continue to play this proactive game plan, Seth's on 10, and force Seth to find some kind of an answer, some kind of a plan, some kind of a way back into this game.
Yeah, and the game is not over. This is not like a life or death situation for Seth, but really like breaking things down when you find yourself behind the 8 ball as Seth is in this situation, and you're trying to look for a way back. There's a couple of routes you can take. Number one is like, can I just get my opponent dead? Something that the rogues can lend themselves to sometimes, tempoing out, attacking with evasive creatures. That's going to be difficult with an opponent at 27 life, a resolved Omnath. The other way you can do it is can I scrape together a way to neutralize Nassif's threats, at least the urgent ones? That's also going to be difficult with no way to remove Lucky Clover from the battlefield. But from Seth's perspective, I think the first order of business is let's make sure I'm countering these Escape to the Wilds, or he doesn't specifically know Escape to the Wilds is in Nassif's hand, but let's make sure things don't get any worse with a card like that resolving. And then second order of business, let's find a way to get this Omnath off the battlefield.
Now look at this, just a disgusting 2-for-1. It's not even really a 2-for-1 because the Bone Crusher Giant can still come down as a 4-3. Double Stomp, thanks to the Lucky Clover, is going to deal with both copies of these Thieves Guild Enforcers here. And Bone Crusher Giant, we kind of discussed this throughout the weekend. I touched upon this with some of the other experts I've been working with, Reed. I'm interested to get your take on it as well. It really is just the workhorse of Standard. It's not splashy. It's not the headline act by any means. Bone Crusher Giant is sort of the backbone, the support card of many top-performing decks in Standard at the moment.
Yeah, you said it, Riley. This is it's just like such a bread and butter card. It does an important job, which is
but really nice bread, like expensive bread, right? Like the not just the sort of the 50-cent bag of bread from the supermarket. This is like artisanal, handcrafted bread. This is like French butter, like the good stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Everybody needs bread. This is doing the job that's really important for a lot of decks, providing early defense removal, and it does it just phenomenally. Attacking on a 4/3 body on the back end of a removal spell is you're not really going to get much better than that in any era of Magic. And indeed, we do see Bone Crusher Giant in everything from Standard to Historic to Pioneer to even Modern.
It really just has. I mean, because you look at it, a 2-mana shock is not worth it when you've got cards like Lightning Bolt or even just 1 mana shock. But it really does get the job done. We're seeing Drown of the Loch now take out this Omnath, Manfield on 3, and back to Nassif now.
Before we move on from the Bone Crusher Giant topic, one thing that's huge, a defining dynamic of this style of game, is that the Lucky Clover doesn't just double the spell, it copies it. So that means if Seth wants to protect his creatures from a copied Bone Crusher Giant, he actually has to spend 2 counter spells. And this is, if it was the other way around, where one single Drown in the Loch could save everything, it might not be so dire for Seth, but it's just impossible for him to find ways to trade at parity here.
Heartless Act is not going to answer that Bone Crusher Giant because of its also secret ability where it deals 2 whenever you target it with anything. So Vantress Gargoyle may be called in to defend. Of course, not going to do a whole lot against that Brazen Borrower here. Although with Seth, he's got 2 copies into the story, a Heartless Act. Maybe he can find some of the tools he needs to keep himself in this one, although it looks very unlikely from this point.
Yeah, so Nassif has a number of ways to remove the Vantress Gargoyle as a blocker, either tapping it with Giant Killer, using that Brazen Borrower. If he wants to go for forcing through the damage, and as you mentioned, Riley, it's kind of an appealing play, given that Bone Crusher Giant cannot be targeted by a removal spell when the opponent's at 2 life.
We may see, we're going to see Gabe go to the sideboard, however, here with Fae of Wishes, go and get 2 cards out of his board. And, I mean, this just widens the aperture so much further as to how Nassif could possibly hope to be pushing through damage. Going to see Cling to Dust in response from Seth. Okay, gain a little bit of life here.
Yeah, tough one from Seth here, because it's like, okay, do I gain life to try to not be dead to the Bone Crusher Giant just at face value, or am I drawing a card out of desperation to find a solution to this dire emergency? It looks like his plan is he wants to gain a little life, get the Bone Crusher Giant off the battlefield, not be dead to immediately to a Fling or Kazul's Fury, and then, at least survive 1 more turn in whatever form that takes.
Well, I've just cast my eyes over Gabe's sideboard here, and I actually don't see either of those cards. It's been very common for Adventures decks to play Fling, and they've moved into Kazul's Fury more recently. But I mean, my eyes could be deceiving me, but I don't see any Fling type effects in Gabe's sideboard here.
Oh, that's fascinating.
It's really interesting indeed. He's got Storm's Wrath, Shatter the Sky, plenty of removal. Ugin as well, negate Mystical Dispute as counterspells, but there's nothing in the way of a Fling effect unless it's hiding somewhere and I can't see it. Here are those Fae of Wishes now. 2 copies of Granted about to resolve. We're going to see there's that Ugin. That's a Ghostfire upstairs. That's going to get it done for sure. Certainly not this turn, but in later turns. And land as well. Yeah, the Branch Loft Pathway here.
Ah, the old 8-mana Lightning Bolt.
Yes, well, it gets when your opponent's on 3, Reed, you'll pay any amount of mana, I imagine.
A bargain at any price.
Yes, exactly right. Exactly right. And now we're going to see another Fae of Wishes, another copy of Granted, and Gabe going to hit the sideboard once again, and maybe looking for. We can see now what he is scrolling through, having a look at some of his options, and you can see there a bevy of them.
So realistically, Seth won the small victory of getting to survive another turn, but there's no way he can come back in this game against this, deluge of card advantage and, finding himself at a precarious life total even to begin with. From the broad perspective of the matchup, if you're a Seth Manfield fan, you can hope okay, this was the Lucky Clover game. And in the next 2, we're going to be able to play fair and square, where maybe Seth can have more agency over making his cards line up properly. In particular, game 2, he gets to be on the play again, so maybe he'll be ready with that Agonizing Remorse or Lofty Denial to answer the Lucky Clover. But yeah, I mean, that's really what this Rogues deck is hoping for, is let's bring it down to my level, and let's make the Adventures deck play the game that I want to play with them.
Into the Story draws 4. It's a great rate, 4 mana for 4 cards. Not the sort of thing you have too often. You can see it only happens like that as we head further into the late game. But Seth is going to have a tough time here finding his way forward. Soaring Thought Thief in hand. And Agadeem's Awakening could be cast, but no, just going to pass the turn. And now with Ugin, Negate, Mystical Dispute, Brazen Borrower. Just an embarrassment of riches here for the French Hall of Famer. Let's see which tool he elects to use. Escape to the Wild's going to open it up with... Decides he doesn't have quite enough resources just yet here. And
Nassif kind of famous for always taking the safe route. A lot of us at home would be like, okay, let's just get this over with and move on to the next game. That's not really the way Nassif thinks about things. He's going to take the most precise surgical approach. Yes. Not going to tap out for something big and unwieldy like an Ugin when Seth has open mana. He's just going to march inexorably and carefully towards the win.
Yes, I think Nassif, if given a choice between an 85% option that took 5 minutes or a 99% option that took 5 hours, he would go for, he'd happily spew those 5 hours out in order just to make sure he sealed the deal.
Indeed, those are almost his two favorite things: is having a high percent chance to win the game and taking a long time to do it.
I mean, he'd prefer it, right? Like if he had a 5 hour thing that was only going to give him 85% chance, he might be tempted. He might be tempted by that. Here's Omnath now. That was
Now,
one
I
of the
guess
ones snagged with that escaped wilds. Go ahead, sorry.
if I can see any miracle comeback for Seth, it might be through, secret door number 3, which is the rogues deck actually milling the opponent out. Nassif's life total is basically not in jeopardy here at 27 and prospects of gaining more. So maybe you turn your sights to, hey, my opponent's resolved a couple of escape to the wilds. If they get careless and I can line up some pretty special, sequence of plays, maybe there's a way.
Flashes in the Soaring Thought Thief after activating that Vantress Gargoyle, and you can see 24 cards remain in Gabe's library. So that's, I mean, Seth has certainly done a lot more deck damage than he has done life total damage here. And it's certainly not harmed by Gabe burning through his library with cards like Escape to the Wilds. But it certainly is a bit of a long shot here for the American.
Seth, it's fun to see the gears turning, though I don't envy his position. It's nice to see a player of Seth's caliber kind of navigate through this. Remember that part of the information here is face up. Seth knows the cards that are on adventure. He knows the cards exiled to Escape to the Wilds. He knows the Ugin, Mystical Dispute, and Negate that have been chosen off of Fae of Wishes. So he's thinking, like, what do I have to do to not just be dead to the Ugin? And that involves holding up a counterspell, holding up mana to pay for Mystical Dispute, maybe holding up a second counterspell, and or bluffing in a way that he's going to discourage Nassif from going for the win. And then he's also, on top of that, taking the next step of, like, how do I progress my own game plan while not leaving this vulnerability?
Yeah, he's trying to keep a lot of plates spinning here. It's not an impossible task, but it certainly is a very difficult one, especially with Nassif holding on to that 8-mana Lightning Bolt and 2 counterspells with which he can back it up. Omnath's best friend here, Fabled Passage coming down.
Now, the second and third abilities of Omnath are huge here. The mana is going to grant Nassif the ability to cast multiple spells in the same turn. Not like he needs it, but that's just a way to further improve his advantage or actually get Seth dead. And the third ability, would just kill Seth outright. So if he's able to find a Beanstalk Giant or Escape to the Wilds, that could be big here.
So Brazen Borrower, 3 copies of Petty Theft here, or 2 copies plus the original, can bounce everything that Seth's got back up to hand here. And this is going to put Seth to the question. Do you have an answer here for this 4/4?
Right, blocking basically out of the question here. So Seth may have to use Drown in the lock to kill a creature. He doesn't want to do that because that card has an important job, and it's countering Ugin or any equivalent spell that would ruin his day.
There's the Brazen Borrower. Its work is done. Quite a rap sheet for that Petty Thief there. And now Gabe able to swing in for 5, but he'll take his time before doing it. How do you sequence this turn here? If you're Nassif, do you attack first? Do you test the waters with Omnath? Okay, here's the attack now.
Yeah, this is perfect attacking only that represents lethal. Giant Killer stays back to make sure that something like a Soaring Thought Thief wouldn't do the trick. Now, Cling to Dust is a reason to maybe send that additional point of damage into the red zone, but the point is, you make Seth take an action, you make him cast some spells and tap his mana, then you can go for something devastating like that Ugin after combat, once Seth has already committed resources.
So there's that Cling to Dust. It's going to put Seth back up to 5 here, which means that he can take the Omnath hit and go down to 1. I mean, this is a staggering performance here from Manfield. He has absolutely... I mean, he's not just clinging to dust, he's clinging to this game desperately with both hands, digging those fingernails in.
Yeah, and I think a lot of us at home would ask, like, what's the point? Like, why do you keep battling so much when there's not a clear route to victory? And the fact is, surprising things happen. If you are in the game, like something, your opponent could make a mistake. You could unlock some kind of play that you maybe
Hmm.
hadn't thought of originally. So
Oh yeah,
Seth's just saying, like, if I concede the game, I have zero chance. If I
yeah.
keep playing, maybe there's something,
Here's an Ugin that is going to resolve, and you'd imagine this is going to end the game fourth, right? But it's interesting as we see Seth go down. It's interesting you mentioned that, Reed. Reminds me, who was it? There's this player, an American fella, Hall of Famer, good-looking bloke, and he always talks about never concede, and he practiced what he preached as well. Who is it? Like, just never concedes, right? Dead on board, waits for the opponent to attack.
Sounds like
Who is
a
it?
smart bloke, smart
Yeah,
fella.
yeah. I guess many people say that. I don't know how true it is. In any case, there are certainly those amongst the vaulted halls of power and magic who will say no, play it out to the final whistle. Never concede. Wait till they've you know actually got you dead. And I imagine a lot of them studied and graduated from a Duke University. Oh, thank you. We hit the sideboards now. And these players are going to make some adjustments here. Although, as we've talked about throughout this weekend, Reed, we don't see too much sideboarding out of the four-color Omnath Adventures deck.
Yeah, that's a huge, structurally important aspect of the adventure deck is Fave Wish is just outrageously powerful card. It gives you access to all of these niche effects that get you out of troublesome situations in game one and in the sideboard games for that matter. But it comes at the cost of, you don't get to bring in 4 red cap melees when you play against mono red. You don't get to bring in 4 mystical disputes when you play against Demir. Um, these slots are spoken for, and it does mean that your ability to tailor for the matchup that you're facing in game 2 and 3 is limited.
Decent looking hand here for Seth on the play. He's going to have answers to a lot of the stuff that the Seth will be doing. Although there's no answer for the turn 2 Lucky Clover, is there? That Drown in the Lock's going to be hard pressed to hit it.
Yep, a huge dynamic here is Drown in the Lock is probably, maybe just the best card in Seth's deck, bar none. But it does take a couple of turns to get traction before it can counter and kill whatever Seth needs it to. And we saw in game number 1, Nassif just totally willing to say, hey, I'm going to make you have it, turn 2 Lucky Clover, like show me that Lofty Denial. I think a lot of us would maybe be scared to make a play like that when the card is so important in the matchup. But I think it's right, frankly, just for Nassif to try to score that easy win when he has the opportunity. So far, no Lucky Clover showing on the screen.
No, so a brief reprieve here for Seth, who I don't know. I mean, whether this deck he expected to just chew up through all the Omnath decks very easily or not. I mean, you don't bring a deck like this to a tournament it's going to be dominated unless you think you're going to be good against that dominant deck. But, apart from that sort of, that weakness of the turn 2 Lucky Clover, the Rogues deck has really put up the numbers against Adventures so far. And, really shook things up this weekend.
Yeah, I think this Rogues deck is like, if you get to play the games without Lucky Clover, you're on cloud 9. You're loving it. And I think Seth, his experience at practicing, his hope for the tournament, and in fact, the way he designed his deck was, I think I get to play enough of those games without turn 2 Lucky Clover that this deck choice is valid. When I get to be on the play, I have a number of ways that can a number of ways to dismantle the turn 2 Lucky Clover. And they don't always have it. They don't get to mulligan to 5 looking for Lucky Clover and think everything's going to be great against my heavy removal and permission deck. So, Seth's willing to take his lumps in the games that went like our previous one. In exchange, he's going to be really, really well set up for a game like we're getting into right now.
I think the other thing that's important to note here is, we've been talking a big game about turn 2 Lucky Clover and how good it is in this matchup, and it certainly is. I'm not trying to walk that back, but it's not the end of the world. It's not like Stony Silence against Affinity and Modern. It's not the sort of you can never ever come back from it. It does obviously increase the win percentage of the Omnath deck whenever they play it on turn 2, but I'm sure Seth has won games with this deck against I think we may be overshooting the runway a little bit in how dire
I'm
we
glad
paint
you brought
it.
that up. It's certainly the case that Seth still gets to play when Lucky Clover's on the battlefield. It's more of like when the game is close anyway, that's the card that's going to put it over the top in favor of the Omnath adventure player. But as I said, like you can't just mulligan to 4 or 5 and say I have turn 2 Lucky Clover, I win, because you have to have the support, you have to have the mana, you have to have the adventure creatures, you have to have the well placed Escape to the Wilds or whatever it might be. So it's part of a recipe that leads to Nassif winning. It's not an auto win on its own, as you wisely pointed out.
Look at this, got some Galaxy Brain stuff here from Seth, who exiles a card in his own graveyard rather than going after Gabe's. Of course, it makes sense. He's got a Drown in the Loch in hand and wants that to be as active as possible. And here's a well-placed Agonizing Remorse, revealing double Beanstalk Giant, Omnath, and a fist full of lands. Now, given that there is the threat of the Omnath next turn, thanks to Crag Crown Pathway, I don't know, it seems pretty clear to me you just snag the Locus of Creation, right?
Yeah, although if you take a look at Seth's hand, he has answers, cards that can pretty cleanly answer the Omnath in Mystical Dispute and even Lofty Denial, whereas the same is not true of the Beanstalk Giant. So you kind of just weigh those factors of like, one card is better, but I have more appropriate answer for it, versus another card is a little bit weaker, but will probably resolve if Nassif casts it. And now it gets interesting when you start thinking, what does Nassif parse from the way that went down? You're not expecting your opponent to Agonizing Remorse, leave you with Omnath, and then your Omnath to just cleanly, uncontested resolve the following turn. That's not really how things work when you play against Seth Manfield. Yeah. So I'm curious to see how Nassif is going to use that information or make conclusions based on what happened there.
Look at this, just perfect mana base. 4 basics of 4 different colors and immediately can cast Omnath. But I think, Nassif has sniffed it out and he's going to go for the Beanstalk Giant instead. This makes sense. Obviously, if Seth chose not to take the Omnath, it sends a clear signal here. And this is a lesson that I actually learned from none other than you, Reed. This was a lesson that I learned in one of your many, many articles you've written over the years. Whenever you're given the opportunity to prevent your opponent from doing what they clearly want to do, you should take it. Even if it doesn't seem like it's going to be beneficial for you in the long run, you should never just headlong run into your opponent's plans, because you should always trust that your opponent is going to be better than you give them credit for.
Yeah, that's a huge, thing when you watch players like Seth and Gab, when you play against them. The structure of the Magic Pro League and the experience that I've had playing in these arena tournaments the last couple of years, it's like I practice on the arena ladder. Everything's going great. My removal spells are working the way I want them to. Everything's going according to my plan. And then when I face one of these players in a tournament situation, they do everything the way I don't want them to do it. It's like they never run into the removal spell when I'm leaving my mana open. They never make that error in attacking or blocking. They never make the mistake that you need them to make. They always make things as difficult as possible on you.
The nerve.
Yeah, no kidding.
How dare they not act like all the other smooth-brained jackals on the ladder, and they play around your removal spells. Oh, I don't know what. It's no pleasing some people. Looks like a decent spot here for Seth, taking one from this Play of Wishes, but the clock really isn't ticking too quickly here for the American. And
yeah, so a couple of cards to keep an eye on in Seth's hand. He's got Drown in the Loch, which I said it earlier in this game. This might just be his best card, at least his most efficient and versatile card. It really does it all. I think we're going to see Seth kind of put that in the bank for an emergency. Another one to keep an eye on is Lofty Denial, which is not his best card. This is a soft counter that Nassif can play around successfully in a number of ways. So the answer to whether or not Lofty Denial can line up well will be important in these games. If Seth can land this as a successful Force Spike and or get a flying creature to stick on the battlefield, that's a big deal. Whereas if Nassif can navigate in such a way that this is a dead card, that's a big deal as well. Let's keep an eye on that.
In comes the Fave Wishes once again. Nickeling and diming Seth down. But as you can see, Seth has kept up 2 mana with astonishing consistency here. Gabe is just going to finally shove, puts that Omnath onto the stack. No way to defend it in hand here. And so it is going to run right into either this... the Lofty Denial isn't going to be able to counter it, but at this point, the Drown of the Loch should be able to. How many cards in the graveyard there?
So here's an example of Nassif making things as difficult as possible on Seth. He's going to choose the 7 mana mark to cast Omnath, where he knows, hey, Lofty Denial can't counter this. Mystical Dispute can't counter this. You have only 2 mana. If you want to let it resolve and kill it after the fact, fine. I got my 2-for-1. And again, Seth is loath to use that Drown in the Loch because that's his most important tool. That's his sort of like emergency, break glass in case of emergency type of card.
Yeah, and I don't know that there were even 4 cards in the bin. Difficult to tell here from this position if there were 4 or not.
Importantly, Agonizing Remorse does exile, so that's not adding to Nassif's graveyard necessarily.
Yeah, of course. Yes, after having 2 copies of that card already resolve.
Oh, Riley, did you see, if you take a look at Seth's camera, he kind of shook his head there, maybe regretting the way he managed his mana the previous turn. You never really know what's going through these players' heads, but seemed like Seth was not thrilled about the way that exchange played out.
Yeah, because if he hadn't put Lurrus in hand, he would have been able to play 2 counterspells. Once again, cling to dust on his own card, his own graveyard, wanting that Drown the Loch to be as relevant as possible. Finds a Thieves Guild Enforcer. No 6th land here for Seth so far. Cling to Dust certainly impressed me. I fiddled around with it a couple of decks in the days of Uro, where it did a lot of work. Unassuming, it's a very unassuming card read, but a great engine in the late game.
Yeah, I mean the bar for a 1-mana card is a lot lower for than it is for cards that cost 3, 4, 5 mana. Just that little something, I'm gonna cantrip and get you a little bit of value. I'm gonna be an important answer to some problematic graveyard recursive cards. That it does a lot, especially in a deck like Seth's that's looking to go long, and you want to make sure that Croxa is not hitting you, right?
So we're going to see a Thieves Guild Enforcer followed up by a Drown the Loch here, which will get rid of Omnath before it has the chance to bless Gabe with any landfall triggers. And this leaves up a Mystical Dispute, but not much else. Edgewall Innkeeper off the top here for Gabe, who may want to sort of just switch gears here and start to attempt to get value off of those Innkeepers, although his hand is a little sparse. It is a little sparse. Can you cast this Beanstalk Giant after this? How many lands does he have? Okay, enough to only be able to cast 1 Innkeeper before the Giant comes down.
Yeah, Nassif's going to be happy about this because basically anytime you can get a 2-for-1 against the Dimir deck, you're happy because its goal is so much around centered around trading resources. And you make that harder on them when you can play your Innkeeper, get immediate value. Now Seth untaps it. It's like, boy, I really want to kill this Innkeeper, but if I'm spending my mana on my card to do that, that's an unprofitable exchange. And it's something that Nassif can take advantage of and sort of piece together a win by putting together many of those exchanges back to back to back to back.
A great rip here for Gabe, who finds Bone Crusher Giant. That's a clean answer to the Lurrus, in addition to being a 4/3 that draws not only 1, but potentially up to 2 cards here with these Edgewall Innkeepers. So I imagine Gabe very happy to draw this absolute workhorse of a card here.
Good point, Riley. This could be a major turning point in the game, the Bone Crusher Giant. As you mentioned, Lurrus is a really important card to get off the battlefield if the game is going to progress, go long here. And it's just crucial, that double duty with the Innkeepers. So Seth, with really no clean answer for it available to him right now, I think Nassif's going to make a big step towards turning the game in his favor right now.
Because one situation that the and you're going to see it right here. One situation that the Dimir deck can get itself into is just it loops Thieves Guild Enforcer with Lurrus. And obviously the Thieves Guild Enforcer doesn't yet have Death Touch, but when it does, it's just so hard for creature-based decks to beat a 3/2 Death Toucher that gets played every turn for 1 mana with Lurrus. And so that's why removal spells like Bone Crusher Giant are so critical in situations like this, because it prevents that kind of recursion, that value engine from starting to turn over. Because otherwise, I mean, a lot of green decks are just stopped in their tracks by that sort of play.
Yeah, crucially, Nassif picking his spot to get into combat before Thieves Guild Enforcer is powered up, before he actually has the requisite 8 cards in his graveyard. Otherwise, that would, the Thieves Guild Enforcer would just trade for the Bone Crusher Giant. But or excuse me, for the Beanstalk Giant. But here he gets to eat that creature. Seth might be thinking, hey, I could just get it back next turn anyway off of Luris. Now Nassif drops the hammer with Bone Crusher Giant on Luris and leaves Seth pretty much unprepared to deal with this this existing Beanstalk Giant.
Now Gabe's taking his time with this play here. Going to cycle away the Triome first, maybe just get a little bit more information before committing to the Bone Crusher Giant play. Finds a land with it. And so here, now with enough mana to cast the Edgewall Innkeeper and then both halves of the Bone Crusher Giant, I imagine that's what we're going to see here. That Luris does require an answer. Although, does this run into Lofty Denial?
So yes and no. Lofty Denial will be able to actually tag the 4/3 body of the giant, but you still, if you get to resolve the 2 damage aspect and you get the 2 cast triggers on Edgewall Innkeeper, you know, that's a win for you. You don't mind the 4/3 creature hitting the graveyard.
Yeah, you only get like a 3-for-1 rather than a 4-for-1. Oh, so sad. So sad. All right, Bone Crusher Giant now. Stomp, probably what we're going to see coming up next. Oh, 3 mana, actually. Just cast as a 4/3. Okay, all right.
Yeah, Nassif is, well, one way to put it is maybe overthinking things here. Who knows, maybe he's thinking at exactly the correct level. But what we know from our perspective, Riley, is that the Stomp would have resolved. But Nassif might be thinking, it's just too bad for me if I cast Stomp and this gets drowned in the locked, because then it never goes to the Adventure Zone. It goes straight to the graveyard. He doesn't get those guaranteed two card draws. So there Nassif is playing for the worst case scenario and just saying, I need to get the guaranteed value. I can't make this 1-for-1 exchange when I really need to trigger my Edgewall Innkeepers. And
that comes at a little bit of a cost. I mean, I think Gabe's still in a great position here, but that means that Thieves Guild Enforcer not only comes back once again for another tilt of the windmill with Luris, it also gets Gabe to that critical 8 cards in graveyard, turning the 3/2 into the Enforcer into a 3/2 Death Toucher. So that does change things, not to mention another Thieves Guild Enforcer in hand. It does make the beatdown plan a little more tenuous here.
Yeah, so that was a fascinating turn just on a number of levels. Remember, we can see both players' hands. The players do not see the opponent's hand. And so that's one of the really tricky things about playing against this Dimir Rogues deck is the variety of answer cards that Seth could have at his fingertips at any given moment. You sort of have to pick and choose which ones you're going to play around and when. Nassif went for a very conservative play in the face of uncertain information. He probably would have effectively won the game on the spot if he had just made the greediest play possible and stomped the Luris. Now he's merely in a good position. And the main difference is that Seth is now going to have access to these multiple Thieves Guild Enforcers with Death Touch to stop the bleeding from the Beanstalk Giant. And Nassif, instead of just scoring the clean, easy win through combat, is going to have to actually settle in for the long game and win via card advantage. But he is pretty well set up to do that.
I think it's very easy for the armchair experts to sit here and go, oh, you know, he misplayed this, should have played that, mislethal here, that, the other thing. But I think ultimately, you know, Gabe would be able to sit down and make the case for why he made all of the plays that he did, as we see Seth 2-for-1 himself with these 2 counterspells to prevent that escape from the wilds from resolving here. And, you know, it's difficult to, I mean, I'm certainly not going to sit here and say that Gabe played this one badly, because it's characteristic, I think, of him to plan for the worst case scenario, and he's not afraid, as we've talked about already, to grind out those long games.
Yeah, and the important factor here is if you make a conservative play and you win the game just a little bit slower or with a little bit more effort, there's nothing lost there. You know, like, you know, you might be at home screaming, Nassif, just go for it. He doesn't have a counterspell. But if the outcome is the same anyway, and Nassif can win the game nice and safe and clean without taking that risk, that he is okay with that. He is not going to feel silly when he watches this replay, even though, you know, we know that Seth didn't have Drown in the Lock at that particular moment.
So, looks like Manfield, yeah, considering playing this Agonizing Remorse, and I bet he's very glad he did so, because that stomp could have been backbreaking here. But as it is, this Thieves Guild Enforcer is doing a great job of holding off all of Gabe's clowns here.
Huge play there, Riley.
Oh, finds another Bone Crusher Giant.
And a huge draw there, Riley.
Oh, man. What a rip from Gabriel Nassif there. That really was something. After getting that last one taken out of his hand, he rips a fresh one right off the top. I mean, there is another Thieves Guild Enforcer here, so it's not just over, but still, that was poetry in motion there. What a draw!
Yeah, Seth actually would have been like very, very much in this game if Nassif had just drawn, you know, basic forest that turn.
Yeah.
Then the game is very much still a contest. The Bone Crusher Giant, what is this? A 5-for-1? I mean, creature, two draws, and two stops. That's just, you know, he drew Escape to the Wilds off the top of his deck there, except even more impactful because it changes the context of the battlefield so much as well.
Snap block here for Seth as we see the Thieves Guild Enforcer trade with the Bone Crusher Giant, but he's down to 4, facing off against another Boney G that's freshly cast. And here, 2 copies of Soaring Thought Thief and Mystical Dispute, in addition to those Cling to Dust, the only thing that Seth has got available to him. I mean, Gabriel and Nassif has played an absolute blinder here. I want to give full credit to Seth as well, who has dug his heels in and refused to just roll over. But Gabriel Nassif, I mean, a perfect conjunction here as we see Seth's about to scoop him up. A perfect conjunction of play skill and just a tad of good fortune when he needed it. And you have to say, Gabriel Nassif, the worthy victor of this, our first quarterfinal.